My name is Jennifer Baer, and I'm going to be presenting today on performance assessment based off of our text from Chapter 2 of the following textbook. Performance assessment is a means of actually showing or performing your knowledge on a given task. As stated on page 42 of our reading, a performance assessment must enact the skill you're intending to measure. To qualify as a performance assessment, what is evaluated must 1. Be a product or performance, and 2. An application of a targeted skill. Students showcase higher order thinking skills and tie together their understanding of several assessments or several standards or objectives within one given task. They are required to apply their knowledge in a self-created final product. It is not like a standardized test where students are given multiple choice questions and fill in a bubble. A performance assessment is generally graded with a rubric. In my 4 years of teaching, I have not presented my students with a performance assessment as it was defined in our reading. My former school district, we did not have a district or building-wide performance assessment. Instead, what we had were just standardized assessments. The only time I can think of where my students were presented with a performance assessment type activity was during the M step, where they were given a performance task. What I have done are different projects, tasks, and lessons with my students that have shared elements of a performance assessment. So I'm going to be sharing those with you today. My teaching partner and I use project-based learning, or PBL, activities and math exemplars. Now, unfortunately, the math exemplars are no longer offered free online. But I'm going to be starting off this presentation by sharing my examples of performance assessment-like activities that I have used. So as you can see here, I have my project-based learning assignments, and they are similar, but they're on a much smaller scale of a project performance assessment. So at the end of the year, my teaching partner and I purchased these guides from teacherspayteachers.com, and they're like miniature versions of a performance assessment. So as you can see on the screenshot of the covers, these PBL assignments have standards listed. But unlike what we read, these projects only cover a small handful of standards. Although neither packet addresses it, there are ELA standards that are also being showcased in the final product. These are some examples of student pages that get completed by the student. Some of the pages are independent of one another, whereas others are dependent and build on the previous page as the days progress. But I do want to clarify this is a purchased item, so I'm only going to showcase a few of the sheets, and I kind of layer the pages to protect the work of the original owner. But I'm going to explain to you what all this assignment entails. So the first day allows the student to be artistic, but I think what that really does is kind of build anticipation for the whole project. And each day has a lesson associated with it. The lesson does not teach the skill that the standard is addressing, but instead it's teaching about how we'll apply that skill. So for example, day 3 focuses on creating a budget. So the lesson is about what a budget is. We don't learn about how to add or multiply decimals because they're supposed to already know that coming into this assignment. But it's, like, why is a budget important, and where does the money come from, and how do you prioritize your finances? But the culmination of these skills really peaks towards the end of the project, where the students showcase their ability to use fractions and decimals, and they're challenged to think about what their numbers mean and what their unit is and how to apply this information. So they estimate and divide whole numbers, look at recipes and fractions and multiply those, as well as analyze costs by dividing decimal numbers and figure out how to determine how much profit that they'll make per cup of lemonade. And it sounds like a lot of work, but it's paced really nicely, and the excitement that the students have of building their own lemonade stand kind of clouds the realization of how much math is really being required of them. Now, how a PBL is not like a performance assessment, it covers a lot fewer standards. So like I mentioned before here, there's only 4 standards that were tied to this. There's not a rubric. I actually graded all these packets upon completion, and I based the grading off of effort, correct work, and answers, and it was really time consuming. As I explained, students have mini lessons each day where they learn about how to start a business, which does not seem to be the case for a performance assessment. It seems that in a performance assessment, students are given their demonstration of outcomes, or the task, and the assignment or prompt, as well as their measurement of success at the beginning. Then students work to come up with their own plan on how to carry out the performance. In this PBL activity, their final products are very similar, whereas in a performance assessment, it seems that students create their own vision and plan, which allows for a diversity of routes for students to meet the final outcome, their objective and learning targets. I have one more example of a PBL that I have done, and this is based off of a lesson from Oakland County Schools. Oops. So a colleague and I actually reformatted this lesson so that way it would be a culmination of all the 5th grade Michigan State standards for life science, and it's a little bit more aligned with what a performance assessment is. The task of this assignment is distributed up front, and they also receive their rubric that I'm going to display on the next slide. So how they spend their time is a little bit more self-guided, unlike the previous PBL where each step was covered in a day. The objectives or learning targets are not clearly defined in this assignment, but it is an editable document, and so, if I try to create this PBL to be more like a performance assessment, I can easily plug those objectives in. So the rubric goes along with the outcomes of the task that was given to the students to display their understanding of the Michigan State standards for life science. And as you can see at the bottom of the rubric, it was very recently updated for a previous class. And I reformatted this rubric to align better with what our objectives were. So just like our reading, where teachers sit down at professional development and are continually trying to calibrate and redefine the rubrics they use, I felt that the rubric that we were using in the past also needed to be redefined. My colleague and I previously used the rubric that was created by Oakland County Schools, but since we had higher expectations for what the final product would encompass, it actually only made sense that the rubric would also need to be redefined to match that. So this is an example of the math exemplars that I had mentioned earlier. And so what these are their story problems, and they require higher order thinking. The way students solve these problems showcase their understanding of math concepts, and they're required to have illustrations, numbers, and words to explain their thinking. Exemplars K-12 is a company that created these, and they have their own style of rubric that identifies where students' level of understanding is. The nice thing is that the teachers can view examples of what each level of understanding looks like, and I'm going to include some examples of that in a few slides. The scoring looks something like this, and so the program Exemplars K-12 has come up with their own scoring system. Instead of a rubric, they've defined students into 4 categories: novice, apprentice, practitioner, and expert. And so feel free to pause the video if you would like to see how students from the previous question would be scored and categorized by looking this over. But what I have for you are 2 examples of student work and how they were scored. So the first one is an apprentice, and what this means is a student has come up with a way to solve the problem that would actually work, but there's some error in their computation. And the second showcases an example of a student performing at the expert level. So this means that not only did the student get the correct answer, but they also correctly showcase their understanding through the use of diagrams, mathematical approach, and words to explain their thinking. The number of standards that this exemplar covers is much fewer than what a performance assessment would do, and typically they only cover like 1 to 2 standards for your grade level. There's a different way of grading, which is fine. The way to grade these exemplars is defined really well, and the examples included are really beneficial to the teacher. There is only 1 task, and it's completed in 1 sitting, and although the task might require a few steps, it's not as thorough as a performance assessment. There is only 1 answer, although there's multiple approaches, which is what I really like about the exemplars. Students are challenged to find an approach that works for them. They need to be able to self-check to see if their answer is reasonable, and if it doesn't make sense, that they can go back and kind of correct where they think they may have made their mistake. Now, although I have not had the experience of using a performance assessment, I do have an understanding of how they're organized. Performance assessments need to be organized by compiling groups of standards. In the chapter we read, we discussed how oftentimes the standards are viewed as a checklist. So as teachers guide students throughout the school year, sometimes these standards just get checked off. Instead, what the book describes is these standards need to be viewed as parts of an engine. So we have to allow the students to put the parts of the standards together and show us how their engine runs. This mentality is actually what my colleague and I had for our body systems PBL, where we taught the lessons for all the standards on the body system according to the Michigan State standards. But then at the end of the unit, it was the job of the student to prove that they had an understanding of all the standards by bringing everything together. So a performance assessment is organized into 3 parts. The first one being the outcome, which is comprised of objectives, learning targets, or standards. The second is the demonstration of these outcomes, which lays out the task or the assignment or the prompt. And then lastly, the measurement of success needs to be included, which is the rubric, and that has to come at the beginning. So for me, because I didn't actually do performance assessments, but I did performance-like activities, I exceeded the limit of 5. None of the projects we did were near to the scale or level that a performance assessment is. So even though they're still time-consuming, they're not nearly as time-consuming. They're such small-scale types of assessments that they're not as demanding. And so I use them as they fit into like our weekly or monthly schedules, and I can't put a number on how many times that they were used. The first part of developing a performance assessment is to structure your outcomes. So this is comprised of objectives and learning targets, which should align with your standards that students have been taught. Now, as educators, we probably all understand how quickly a school year passes and how precious our time with students is. I like to make sure time spent together in the classroom is meaningful by ensuring that I'm meeting all the standards that I'm required to teach. In my former school district in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, we adhered to both the Common Core state standards as well as the Michigan state standards. Performance assessments, along with project-based learning and the math exemplars, required students to look at the big picture, self-check, and use multiple problem-solving skills. Exemplars required students to self-check and ask themselves if their answer was reasonable. The project-based learning assignments required students to tie several skill sets together to complete one task. Now, I did include an example of a rubric earlier, but the measurement of success of a performance assessment is one of the challenges, and it's important that we make sure that the measurement is a valid representation of the student's performance. We read in Chapter 2 that people who study tests fear the potential error in that performance assessment can offer. So, and of course, there's always room for human error, but if teachers are able to have the time to come together and ensure that the rubrics that they're using define a commonality, the window of error should decrease. It's important that the teachers have the time to meet and evaluate student work together to calibrate their perspectives, to ensure that they're all viewing the products in the same fashion. My former school district's biggest challenge would be to actually implement a performance assessment. And so, it stems from just the lack of having any performance assessment in place. So the challenges of getting started are fairly great, in my opinion, but they should never deter a district from implementing this. But it won't be easy. The challenges that I came up with was the amount of time it would take to train the staff and execute these performance assessments. They are time consuming. The implementation may require changes to curriculum or require curriculums to reorganize their structure. There would need to be an adequate amount of time at each PD to make sure that our work is meaningful and that everybody is continuing to stay on track. As with adapting any new program, there is a cost associated. And to make sure that it moves smoothly, there would be need to be leaders to turn to. And so the development of a committee within the district and the need for representatives at each building would probably need to be put in place. And then lastly is the issue of accountability. And I know that in my former district, there's always a few teachers who don't always jump on board with new things until they're forced to do so. So there needs to be something in place that really requires people to be held accountable to follow through with the implementation. I know currently with my small-scale implementation of performance-like assessments, my students at the 5th grade level found these challenges enjoyable and a nice change of pace. Students in my former district, they're used to being assessed, so that wouldn't really be much of a change, but the district did go one-to-one this year, so they would have more access to resources. And then lastly, the district already has built-in PD days, so finding the time for teachers to come together shouldn't be that difficult. Now, at face value, these templates look highly valuable. I think the templates really allow the user to take time and look at the big picture. It is obvious that as you go through the templates that a performance assessment is not something that you just throw at your students. The sheet that I really took to is the larger one on the left side of the page, and this template is basically like a roadmap that gets you to the final assessment. I particularly took to the column labeled Learning Activities and Experiences, and it's evident that students need hands-on learning and experiences which I hope most teachers provide. If a group of teachers sit down and plan the sheet together, they'll just learn from each other. My final thoughts here, it seems to be that according to the readings, performance assessment can lead to more rich and authentic experience, builds community among colleagues. It might be difficult, but the templates are